Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Hello. My name is Lynn O'Hara, and I'm the Director of Programs for National History Day. Welcome to our fifth and final in our Ask the NEH Expert series. What I'd like to do is take a minute and say hello to those guests who are joining us, but I do want to mention to everybody who's out there watching live, our goal in this hour is to ask as many questions about building exhibits. So students and teachers who are listening, please go on Twitter, use the hashtag NHD Hangouts, ask your questions. We will get in as many of them in this hour as we can. Very quickly, I'd like to say hello to some of our participants joining us today. Randy Nissen and his students at Toledo Early College High School in Toledo, Ohio are here. We also have one of our coordinators joining us, Sarah Ashbrenner from Minnesota Historical Society. Hi, Sarah. They're going to be helping us ask and answer a lot of questions later. We also have a school joining us from Singapore in just a little while. But to get things started, I'd like to turn things over to Julia Wynn. Julia is a Senior Program Officer at the National Endowment for the Humanities and our host for tonight. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you, Lynn, and thanks to all of you all for joining us tonight. I wanted to say just a few words about NEH before we get started. The National Endowment for the Humanities is a federal agency that supports research, preservation, and education in the humanities. We fund a wide variety of activities, including publication of books, documentaries, as well as museum exhibits, which we'll be talking about today. NEH has been a partner with National History Day really since its founding, and we continue each year to sponsor the first place NEH Scholar Prizes at the national contest. We also offer a special prize for History Day projects that use the Chronicling America digitized newspapers in their projects. Chronicling America is a partnership between the NEH and the Library of Congress that has digitized over 9 million pages of historic American newspapers. These can be really great resources for your National History Day projects. We also have Edcitement, which we like to call the best of the humanities on the web. And Edcitement has a wide variety of resources available to teachers and students, including lesson plans, special features for National History Day and Chronicling America, and links to over 400 vetted websites dealing with a wide variety of humanities topics. Finally, I hope that you teachers out there will consider applying to our Summer Seminars and Institutes and Landmarks of American History and Culture programs. These are summer professional development programs, and they offer a stipend to help defray your travel and living costs for the programs. Finally, our website, NEH.gov, is a great place to explore some of the things that I just touched on briefly, as well as a wide variety of other activities that we sponsor. So that's NEH in a nutshell, and now I would like to introduce our speakers for this evening. We have Barbara Andrews. She is Director of Education and Interpretation at the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel. She's been at the National Civil Rights Museum since 1992 and has had a variety of positions there. She's also worked at the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center in Wilberforce, Ohio. She has curated a number of exhibits, as well as been part of the exhibition design and development team to oversee the renovation and educational content of the permanent exhibits at the National Civil Rights Museum. She is joined by her colleague Ryan Jones. He is a museum educator and staff historian at the National Civil Rights Museum. He's especially interested in the civil rights movement and racial violence in the South in the mid and late 20th century. So now I will turn it over to our presenters. Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us, Barbara and Ryan. We really appreciate taking the time this evening. I thought we would start off by asking the question about when you get started. A lot of students are kind of in this transition phase right now where they've done a lot of research and they're trying to figure out how to get started. So my question to you is, when you start with a museum exhibit, what are some of the things that you keep in mind as the creators?
Well, I tell you, when you start a museum exhibition, There's always the question of space. Space and budget are two major considerations always when we're planning exhibitions. And it seems like there's never enough space and there's never enough budget, but don't allow that to dissuade you from moving forward. Um, but also, the idea around an exhibition is that you can't put everything you think of in the space. So we think about readability and just its aesthetic appeal to an audience. As much as you'd like to tell, you probably need to tell about at least 20% less than that. You want your labels to be as succinct as possible. You don't want to have visitors standing for too long in any single label to read the information that you want to convey, but also to make those labels exciting. Perhaps even starting with a question. A question is always a good way to get an audience engaged. Did you know that geese migrate south, or something, or why they migrate south? And then you could go on and use that as an idea to help your exhibit come to life. The other thing about an exhibition, though, is really the idea of sort of that big idea. What is it that you really want that exhibition to tell you? What do you really want that exhibition to be all about? And those are some of the major considerations initially in thinking about putting together an exhibition.
Well, I'm so glad that you say that, because many of the things that you struggle with on a larger scale, our students also struggle with. And I always make the plug and remind students to make sure you're using the contest rulebook. If you take a look, there's very specific. We have a lot of questions about word count, about size of exhibits, and there's really good explanations in here to help you. But in terms of kind of thinking about, once you have your space and once you have your idea, what are some ways that you approach planning and deciding what you're going to put into your exhibit?
Well, one of the things that we do in terms of planning is that we look for the big ideas. What are the major themes that we want to explore in the exhibition? And do them big ideas, is there enough information? Would they make good subsections? And then how would we portray that information? We also think about creating with our exhibitions, especially the large-scale exhibition, we create a lexicon of sorts so that the language throughout the exhibition is consistent. How we not only grammatically present information, but also what letters are capitalized, what is the readability level. For us, we try to do it at about a 7th grade reading level. That's a comfortable, according to surveys, that's a comfortable readability approach for most audiences. And so that way you don't end up with a lot of words that people don't understand, and the words aren't so small that they become frustrating or annoying, or just, it's just too simple for visitors to really grasp hold of. We think about the objects. We think about photographs and other ways to enliven the exhibition, and what resources in that way will be needed. We have a lot of consideration around where will these artifacts be found? Where can we get these photographs? Again, it kind of all goes back to budgeting as well. And so we look at our budget. We determine, how we would allocate that budget for programs. Do we need to have a catalog? Do we want to have any kind of support materials that go out with the exhibition? How can we create a teacher's guide? Should there be a curriculum for this? How long will the exhibition be on display? Are all sort of questions for consideration. In terms of the length of time, that's really important, especially if you have particularly fragile objects in an exhibition, or you have objects that their prolonged exposure to light could be a problem. And if you're borrowing objects, how long can you extend those loans for? The other consideration is, who is the audience? If there are things that cannot be touched, do we have enough exhibit cases? Do we have enough ways to protect those objects so that they are in fact not damaged by oil from our fingers? They can't be knocked over or easily broken or destroyed in a space, or just some of the considerations. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point about keywords, because I think it's important to think about what are the keywords or the key ideas that you want to get across in your board. Because one of the things that kind of makes exhibits different from, let's say, a paper or a website is that you also have to have something that's visually appealing, because you have to make your audience want to stop and look at your board or read your board. So what are some strategies that students can use to help to make sure that the exhibits that they're building are visually appealing to their and get the viewer's attention, make people want to stop and learn more?
Well, I was talking with Ryan just a moment ago about our website, and one of the first things he said was bright colors. And I do think that bright colors do work in a lot of instances. But the other thing is to create enough white space or enough clear space around your text and around your objects to allow the viewer's eye to shift from one thought or one object to another. You don't want to crowd it in too much. But I also think, like I said, the titles make a big difference. You know, the title of works could be something that really engages an audience, grabs their attention right off. You want to make sure that the lettering size is a good size, not overly large, but large enough to read so one doesn't have to strain. And again, that word count, as you said, is just so important, you know, to make sure that you're not providing just a textbook there on the wall for viewers. We also think about, though, how can viewers connect with this information? Are there resources or information available in the panels that help to extend the life or the learning around an exhibition? And we like feedback. We love feedback. And so if there's a way for viewers to be able to tell you their comments immediately after they finish viewing an exhibition, or give you thoughts about how that exhibition might resonate in their lives, and that's really important, and that's really a great way to engage an audience as well.
Let's go back to this word limit question. All NHD projects have a limit, whether it's the length of a documentary or the number of words in a paper. And exhibit students have the smallest number that they have to deal with. On their boards, they're limited to 500 student-composed words. So those don't count primary source quotes, but they would count what they create. And that's an awfully big challenge, because that's not a whole lot of words, as many students figure out very quickly. What are some strategies you can give students when they're looking at what they've written and trying to edit it in order to have words that are really powerful and impactful?
I would say that the words would be really clear, really provide direction, really answer the question that you've posed or the theme that you've identified. And I just can't stress enough that because we live in this digital age, that any references to additional information where you can read about it would be really helpful. But 500 words is very limiting. You can get to 500 words really quickly, you know, if you're not careful. And so I think that it would be really helpful too to have evaluations. Read these over, allow other people to read them to see if it gets your point across. Input and evaluation, you know, throughout the process is going to help to make sure that you get your message across. But I think that clear, interesting, fun labels, great titles, interesting font patterns, and all that can really be really helpful in helping you to convey what you want to say with the limited amount of words that you're allowed.
That's a really good point, really pointing your viewers to what's important and then helping to define that. Another good tip is action verbs. I always tell students to think about your verbs, because often they can make your writing really powerful, and they can also save you some words when you get rid of some of those helping verbs that kind of like to stick around them and take up space.
Right.
Let me ask you a question. What are some ways that you can make an exhibit interactive? What are some ways that maybe at the National Civil Rights Museum that you do that? And also maybe some ways that our students might think about doing it maybe on a smaller scale, because they do tend to have smaller spaces and a smaller budget. But what are some ways that you encourage your visitors to interact with the stories that you're telling?
Well, at the National Civil Rights Museum, we do have many interactive features that include oral histories, push-button stations, or sensors that allow you to hear oral histories or to have a brief biography on a person come up in lights. And I would say in a student exhibition that I've been engaged by exhibitions that have little peekaboo windows, you know, little sliding opportunities. little surveys that take the form of something visual they can see, almost like a where people can cast a vote about something, even if it's as simple as "Did you know?" You know, but you can cast a vote, and in that way, visitors become really engaged with the exhibition. They can see how many other people have viewed the exhibition and how many other people share the information that they have. There are also talkback screens and boards. If you've got the space, you know, with post-it notes and ink pens and markers, you know, you can respond to questions, leave comments in the space. Also, laptop computers, if you got space for that, put on a PowerPoint that can just run on its own, just kind of loop through programs to kind of break up the reading. Music is also a really great feature. If you can add sound at all to the space, that's another great way to sort of engage the exhibition.
We'll talk a little bit about later about the rules of media devices, but just about everything you said, there's ways to bring those elements in. But one thing I would warn you, probably don't want to bring all of those elements into any one exhibit because that could get a little busy and a little distracting.
Right, unless you've got enough space to handle that, and I mean several rooms, you don't want to put all that together. The only way that might work is with headphones.
Right, that's not going to work on a 6-foot-tall board.
No.
Can I ask really, before we get into questions here, what's your favorite part about doing this? What's the neatest part of your job and the neatest part about creating museum exhibits and working with visitors in those exhibits?
Brainstorming. I love the brainstorming sessions when those out-of-the-box ideas and you just think larger than life about the possibilities. I really like that as a way to begin planning and thinking about exhibitions. It is really powerful to hear how people interpret your thought or idea differently and what people need to see or expect to see. So I really enjoy that part of the job. I also really enjoy identifying and collecting objects and information. I like oral history. I like hearing people talk about the objects that they own, and I like being able to interpret that. And then generally, I just enjoy designing the space.
Ryan, as a museum educator, what is your favorite part of your job and working with exhibits?
Being able to identify the content in the museum with my concentration in school. And working here for 3.5+ years, I learn something new every day. And so here at the museum, we house so many different aspects of this history that is not taught very well in curriculums across the country. And so this place is a really phenomenal center to be able to go in and go far in depth with some of these stories that go much more further than Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman. Here at the museum, under our renovation, we are highlighting everyday people and how people from all ages can make a difference in their community and leadership roles.
I think that's a great point to help students realize that leadership is far beyond just the big names that we all recognize, but there's a lot of leaders whose names we don't necessarily know, but I'm excited to see with the 2015 theme what new leaders we get to learn about at the regional and the affiliate and the national contest. What I'd like to do is make a shift. I'm going to shift to Mr. Nissen's class in Toledo, Ohio, because I know that those students there have a couple of questions. But while we're getting ready there, I just have to ask one question. And again, remember, keep those questions coming on our Twitter feed while we're setting up the students in Ohio. But the question is, can you offer some strategies of some ways to gain the attention of a viewer or get someone to look when they're just walking by and not planning to stop at an exhibit?
Objects do that for us in many ways. To be able to bring to life a story that might seem just routine, and objects automatically catch your eye, and I would say it's something that's unique. It could be, although, something that's also really very familiar to a person, but people like to be able to identify with the tangible evidence of things that they heard about, think they know about, or even sometimes just have seen. A cast iron skillet, has a remarkable resonance with both young people as well as older people, visitors, and almost everybody knows what it is. So you might walk past a whole display that's talking about how to, maybe talking about energy, but if there's an object there, that will automatically, I think, kind of divert that attention and capture your imagination for a moment.
That's a great point. Think about those 3D objects. Mr.
Mm-hmm.
Nissen, what questions do your students have for our guest tonight?
Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to turn this over to a wonderful young freshman named Zaina.
Hi.
Hello.
So I just have a question kind of about the exhibit itself and the content in it. How do you maintain the historical content as well as making it artistic so that it can speak for itself when it's being presented?
We maintain the historical content. When we decided to do the renovation of our exhibition here, we put together an interpretive plan that sort of guided what we wanted to do with the exhibition, what was the story that we wanted to tell. We called in scholars who are preeminent in their fields and are abreast of the history of the various stories that we wanted to tell. So we had about 24 scholars. They represented the areas of religion, constitutional law, the slavery period. They represented education, grassroots organizing, Mississippi politics and race relations. I mean, it was just a whole gamut. Women's history, a whole gamut of subjects. Our scholars were able to assist us in putting together the most poignant stories, the most vivid examples, the facts and the history and the statistics that, even the statistics from 40 years ago that still show themselves to be remarkable as they reveal to us today what life was like then. So we rely on the history, rely on the scholars to help us to make the stories ring true and to have a long life. Does that answer your question, Zaina?
Should the exhibit be able to present itself, or should you have to present it?
I think that the exhibit should be able to present itself. I have been to museums, excuse me, Zaina. I've been to museums where the exhibitions were introduced and somebody walked me through the space. But I think a lot of visitors like to go through a space at their own leisure, and they want to be able to read and to spend time with the exhibition. And so there is a place definitely for a guided tour experience, but I definitely think the exhibition should be able to stand on their own.
Keep in mind, too, as an NHD exhibit, we present them authentically. And the vast majority of time when you go to a museum, you're on your own. You don't necessarily have someone like a museum educator who's telling you what to see in the panel. And you want your viewer to take away what they're going to take away, because part of the experience of a museum is walking through it and seeing what you get it. Great, thanks. Other questions from Mr. Nissen's class?
Thank you.
Thank you, Zaina.
Caleb?
Would you recommend, for the objects, would you recommend like things that illustrate the contributions to modern day events and inventions or ideas that have been shared based off of the legacy of our person or subject? Or would you recommend something that was from that time period that illustrates that?
Well, I think a lot depends on the story that you're trying to tell. If you're actually focused on an object and a person from history, it'll be really great if you have an object that they may have used or that was in vogue during their time period. But also a very interesting thing is to do a comparison and contrast. So if I were talking about the telephone, for instance, and then I might show what a telephone used to look like, but I also might show the telephone of today. One of the artifacts that we have in our exhibition today, or two of the artifacts in our exhibition today, are artifacts that you don't see anymore. And it's really remarkable to see how they do sort of encourage students to talk and to engage with them. We have an old dial telephone in one of our exhibit spaces, and we also have a typewriter. And the typewriter, I think, is probably the most intriguing to young visitors especially. But older visitors as well who remember using typewriters long before these computers, are also really engaged by it. So I think it's a combination of objects, or that you can determine which object would best tell your story. If it's the piece if it's a period object, then that has its relevance. But certainly also contemporary objects do also inspire a lot of interest in visitors.
Thank you.
If you can, I try to use both.
Excellent. Is there another question from Toledo?
I think that's all we have for tonight, Lynn. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'd like to throw a couple questions to our coordinators. We've got Sarah Ashbrenner in Minnesota, and John Taylor was able to get in from Maine. Sarah, I'm going to toss the first question out at you. There's a lot of talk about electronic devices. Can you review not only what the rules are, but some strategies for using them effectively that you've seen for NHD projects?
Yeah, I think that, Lynn mentioned this earlier. The rule book is your friend. You always want to go back to that and sort of get the parameters for what History Day sets out as the rules before you sort of invest your time in this process. And what History Day says, right, is that it has a total of 3 minutes that it can run, and that you must be able to start and stop it. Sometimes students will, just put a song on and have it playing, but I think that's really just sort of a base level for what you can do. No matter what you decide to do, you want to make sure it's pretty fundamentally connected to the content that you're trying to prove. You want to make sure that it is relevant and essential and not just a fun extra. I wouldn't try to use this as an opportunity to convince your parents to buy you an iPad, unfortunately. But, if you're able to find something like a slideshow that is scrolling by, or a song from the time period that was relevant to your topic, I think that's going to enhance the experience as well as contribute to supporting your thesis. And so I think that's really sort of the fundamental question. Is it there to be pretty? Or is it there to help prove your argument? And if you find that it's there to help prove your argument, then it's a good reason to consider including it. I think students often go to the high-tech option, but interactive elements don't have to be high-tech. One of my favorite interactive elements that I've ever seen was at a regional contest, and it was about women nurses. I believe it was during World War II, and they had to carry a backpack that had like 40 pounds worth of supplies in it. And so she found an old-looking backpack and put 40 pounds worth of weightlifting weights in it, so you could pick it up and understand how much that weighed. That wasn't high-tech, didn't cost a lot of money, but it supported the argument, and so that's really the fundamental question.
I think that's a great question to really think about. For any electronic device, what's your purpose, and is that essential? I'm going to throw a question out to John Taylor from Maine here. John, we talked earlier about using objects. What are some props and examples of things that you can use, and what are some things that maybe you shouldn't use in your NHD exhibit? Oh, John, I'm sorry. I think you're muted. Can you go ahead and unmute yourself? There we go.
There we go. Everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. When it comes to objects, what you can use is, again, I think it goes back to what Sarah was saying, where you need to make sure that it's not just a glitzy thing, but that it is something that is going to support your argument. And I actually did get a call today, actually, from a student who wanted to be sure. She's doing an exhibit on Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. And so she wanted to know if it would be okay to, say, build a little model of a house so you could get an idea of where people would have hidden inside of a house when they're on the Underground Railroad. And so something like that, where it's going to support your answers or your major thesis question, is going to be where you want to do. But some of the things that might not be necessary or might not want to do, I guess, would be some sort of weaponry, maybe even some fake guns or knives, anything like that. Anything flammable, I suppose, would be good or would not be good as well. Does that answer the question, Lynn? Or
I think it does. I also tell you know, think about something a little outside the box. If you're
Yeah.
studying the Civil War, we know that there were guns there, but what
Mhm.
do we not know that was there? You know, to think kind of about something that would surprise the person who's coming to your exhibit. Here's a question for Barbara and Ryan from one of our students. What are some things that make an exhibit visually unappealing? What are some things that you don't like to see when you look at museum exhibits throughout the country and around the world?
Too much text.
Mhm.
Yeah, too much text. That's what's going to separate a museum versus a library is way too much text, and I think that engagement with interactives, something that you can touch and listen to, or understand a particular topic or person versus from reading about it. I think that's the main thing that would be most unattractive in a museum setting.
I would have to agree with Ryan in terms of the volume of text, but also I think that just too much in a single space. I think that's a turnoff. If you feel crowded in the space, I want to be able to feel like I have room to really take in the exhibition. It can breathe sort of around me. I also think lighting is really important. You know, I don't like to go into dim spaces unless it's dim because it needs to meet some museum lighting requirement. But I don't like dim spaces. I want it to be bright and engaging.
That's a question. I'd like to actually follow up on your question earlier. You talked about that you really like oral histories and interviews with people who were there or have experience or were primary sources in some way. What are some ways that students could bring an oral history into an exhibit? And because a lot of students ask, and there's been several questions about, should we type up our oral history interview and put it on the exhibit? And what would you say to that student, and what would be some ways they could bring an oral history in effectively?
Oral histories can be added to exhibitions in several different ways, and I do think there is a value to providing a transcript of an oral history, especially if it can be transcribed word for word. A lot of times you'll hear people. I think it's really important when you do oral histories to make sure you transcribe it as the narrator has said whatever it is. You know, we don't necessarily want to clean up the language or make it grammatically correct if it wasn't said that way, and if that is that person's style of speaking. But oral histories can come in on small devices that can just be in the space. They can be linked into larger websites. There are a number of different ways I think that the oral history can be delivered, and certainly a photograph, if possible, of the person you're speaking with is always really helpful too. You want to be able to see you want to oftentimes be able to see who it is that's talking. Throughout our exhibitions, we use oral histories here, and we even use some listening posts where we have some oral histories. In our courtyard of the museum, for instance, I think you may have an image of our courtyard in the listening post. In the courtyard, we have collected a number of oral histories and created some original film that helps to share various stories that we want to portray. We thought to do light boxes outside the museum because we wanted visitors who engaged the site even after our closed hours to be able to know many of the important stories about the history of the museum, about the assassination, the sanitation strike, and Dr. King and the like. And on one of our listening posts, we have oral history testimony from one of the sanitation strike leaders. And that's really powerful testimony to engage audiences who want to know more about that story.
Those are all really good ideas. I also would encourage students that when you do an oral history or an interview, what's the line that keeps sticking with you? And maybe that's what you want to focus on. What's the sentence or two that that person said that you can't quite get out of your mind? I'm going to pass the question here back to Sarah. This is a question from a teacher. And the question is asking, what are some strategies to help students weed through their research to decide what's best for an exhibit and what's just cool and maybe shouldn't make the exhibit board? What are some tips that you would give?
The biggest recommendation that I give students is to take their thesis and print it out really, really big and use that as their guide. You know, tape it to your bulletin board, put it in the front pocket of your binder, and always go back to your thesis, because the whole point of any History Day project is to prove, explain, and support that argument. Everything that you put on your exhibit should go back to supporting that thesis. Everything that you lay out in the thesis, you need to prove and support with your project. And so you should always be using that as your guide. And so if you look at your thesis and you decide, you know what, I don't really need to talk about this person's childhood or you know, their childhood best friends or you know, some other issue, then maybe you just are going to have to leave that go. And so to just always keep going back to the thesis for that, to answer those questions.
Excellent. John, I have a question for you from one of our students. You know that History Day students love coming up with really exciting creative titles, and in a lot of ways that's the first impression. That's what the judges see before they've seen your piece of work. What are some tips you can give students to help them come up with a really good History Day title?
Well, when you are working on a title, you're going to want something that's not just going to be basic and bland. You're not just going to want to say, if you're going to do something on World War II, you don't want the title to be World War II. What I like to do, or what I tell students to do, is try to find something in their research that connects to their thesis, but maybe is from a quote from someone that they are focusing on, or from a text that they are focusing on, that they can pull out that maybe might condense what they are trying to say just in the title alone.
That's a neat strategy. What I'd like to do is, Barbara, question for you and Ryan here. This is an issue that comes up an awful lot. How is it that you keep an exhibit from being cluttered? How do you keep a balance between text and images and make it something that's visually appealing and not too messy? What are some tips you would give our students?
Well, one of the tips that, a parameter that we used was that our exhibit panels, we limited the number of words that could be on a panel or in a subsection. We defined that in advance based upon, a lot of it was visual look, a lot of it was readability, but we established some parameters around that early on. So in terms of text, we knew that in subsections there would only be so many words, that in the lead panels, that we had X amount of room. In our titles, we limited it to so many words, and so we put those kind of limitations on it. In terms of exhibitions and objects, again, we were limited, of course, as any space is, by the overall amount of space that you have totally. But we wanted to put artifacts in there that didn't crowd each other and that allowed for labels, interpretive text to be in the panel, and for the viewer to be able to see that. So largely, it was a kind of, I guess, a visual look for us, that we wanted to create space in there. The museum, prior to renovation, had what we often called a textbook on the wall. And so we went into this project thinking that we did not want to do that again. We wanted to allow this exhibition to have many different points of entry and interest for the visitors. And so our exhibit cases, as well as our text panels, we limited just how much we would put in order to make the space be more approachable for the broadest number of visitors.
Excellent. I'm going to do a question for Sarah, and actually we're going to throw it to our new classroom who's just joined us live. Sarah, one of the questions that came in was from a student asking, can I act as part of my exhibit? So can I dress up in costume? And this student was working on a project on the Salem witch trials, and they asked, could one of the members of our group show what it would have been like to be afflicted? Can you talk about that, what the rule is, and what some strategies might be for that group?
If you're doing an exhibit, there's no costumes permitted in the exhibit category, and so you can't dress up, and it's also not going to be a workaround in those rules to film yourself and then show it on some sort of media device. There's that would sort of be I would say not appropriate as well. I think that if you're really are going to have to ask yourself, are you super interested in that acting element? In which case, you may want to pick a different category. You may want to choose the performance category. But if you guys are committed to the exhibit category, you're going to have to think about what other ways you're going to help your viewer understand what that situation was like. Are there passages from historical documents you can include in your exhibit that somebody could read to get a better feeling? Are there drawings in this case, or some sort of testimony that you could incorporate into your exhibit to give people that understanding and sentiment and feeling without actually doing it yourself as a live part of an exhibit?
Exactly. Every category has its pluses and minuses, and this is just one of those rules and restrictions on exhibits. What I'd like to do is say hello to our last classroom to join us tonight. These are 8th grade students from Mr. Elm's history class in Singapore, where it is Thursday morning. So I wanted to see if students here have a couple questions for our expert. Oh, I think we need a second to unmute. That's okay. Oh, Mr. Elms, are your students ready with a question?
I think we're ready.
I have a first question. What are some common mistakes that students usually make in the exhibit category?
That's a great question. Let's go ahead and let's direct that both to our guest experts, to Barbara and Ryan, and then I'm also going to throw that question to John Taylor. What are some mistakes that you see people commonly make when they build exhibits?
Oh, I think that one of the mistakes that I often see in exhibitions is that the information does not relate, that it's just not engaging. Some of the exhibitions are just kind of dry in terms of their use of color, in terms of use of the space, and then of course it can also be really dry in terms of the text, the information that's provided. You want to catch the viewer or the reader's attention really quickly. You want to be able to provide that impactful information, deliver the message quickly, and then be able to move to the next engaging panel. So you don't want to put too much information in there. You want to give them enough to answer your question, but then there are levels of information to convey, and all that may not be appropriate for an exhibition of a particular size or for a particular audience.
That's a good point. Don't make it boring. Nobody wants to be bored by your exhibit. John, what are some tips and tricks that mistakes that you see students make?
The one I really see, and I'm going to go back to what was just said, is that there is a lot of information overload. That students will try to put too much information into it and then step away from the thesis, and so your thesis statement is very unclear. If you are researching any sort of topic, you at some point need to realize that you will have to shave down what you know and condense it into what you need to present to someone. And so you need going into this, you need to realize that and just be able to start thinking about, as you're looking at your research, start cherry picking what you think is best going to support your thesis statement. And so I think the really big one is the information overload.
Great, thank you. Mr. Elms, what other questions do your students have?
Okay, next. Loudly.
Rule B4 is about crediting sources. Can we be creative in how we display the credits for photos, quotes, charts, or anything? If so, how?
That's, I'll take that one. That's a really good question. It's really important that whenever you use a source that you give a very clear credit. And when you do credits, I always use the phrase with students, I say, okay, it's just the facts, man. What is this? This is an image of. This is a speech titled. Who said it? Who photographed it? When did it come from? What I would say is make sure you give your credit clear, quick, small. Captions, I think, are the bigger challenge because captions are where you're also showing some interpretation and some analysis. You're not just saying, this is a picture of Alice Paul. Okay, we get that. But who was she? And why was she important? And how was she a leader? And that's one of those times where you want to use as few words as possible to really get home, drive home your idea. But I would also say don't get so creative that we lose it. I want to be able to see where this image or video came from so that I understand it. And also keep in mind too, you have your annotated bibliography. That gives the reader enough information to go back if they want to learn more or if they want to see more.
Okay, that sounds good. Can we get one more question? Hello?
Well, this is a pretty cool classroom we're looking at, and I'm wondering what the subject is in this classroom.
This is social studies, and I have a class of students in here right now working on learning about the end of enslaved Africans, and I also have a bunch of NHD students here working on different projects which are kind of lined up around the outside of the classroom.
I see. Yeah, there were no sofas in my classrooms. I like that.
Okay, we have one more question. You ready, Maddie?
How important is the visual impact compared to historical quality?
That's a great question. Visual impact, historical quality, what's more important? What would you say, Barbara and Ryan?
I think that it's a fine line right down the middle. In one of our exhibits, it's entitled Selma to Montgomery, 1965. And it is as if you are on the march yourself. Dr. King and his associates traveled to Selma to try and fight for voting rights. And while it's important to understand the story and historical accurateness, you're able to feel like you're in 1965. You hear, you can see the marchers, you can see the hecklers on the side, you can see the American flags, and it makes you feel like you are a part of something. And so while, again, it's important to, this is a educational institution, you're able to understand the information as it happened, but it also makes you go back into this time frame. When you're in a history museum, it's always kind of neat to be able to identify to that era in American history.
Yeah, and I would have to agree with that it's kind of a balancing act, and I think a combination of both. We always want to be historically accurate and correct in the information that we portray, but I do think that where there is room to add a little visual emphasis, a little to bring an object or information out, that's really attractive as well.
Let me kind of follow up with a question for you, Ryan, kind of based on what you were talking about. One of the things that students have to do is to figure out how to organize their exhibit and ways in which the reader, who often doesn't have a whole lot of time to look at it, can kind of understand the logical flow. What are some tips that you can give to students to help make sure that what they create is not just visually appealing, but is organized and takes the reader from the start to the middle to the end, all in one board or one panel?
Well, in great museums, you begin in chronological order, and so with the civil rights movement, you kind of begin 400 years from where the museum typically ends its story, and you're able to kind of go into time. So you are leaving slavery. Now you're coming into an era where African Americans are treated as professionals. Then you're going into an era where television plays a major important role. It's much easier to organize its way into history when you can go in order as it happened.
That's a good point, to make sure that you have a good start, a good middle, a good end, and then it's clear where we should start. Should we look at the exhibit from left to right? Should we start somewhere? Is there an arrow or some kind of simple symbols that can help take us just the way when you walk through a museum, there's a pathway through to kind of build that pathway into the board that you're creating? I have a question here for Sarah. Oftentimes when you go to an NHD competition, it's not surprising to see that you're not the only student who chose the same topic, and that's not uncommon. What are some ways when there's multiple projects on the same topic to make your project really stand out and stand above the others?
I think that I would first remind the student who asked that one that, and this is something I put right in my judge orientation, is that you're not judging projects against each other based on the same category. You know, I tell my judges if the projects on polio are the best ones we have, those are the ones that are going to go on to the next level. And so I don't want the student to feel that they somehow have to a unique topic is the only way to do well. And so just be assured on that. I think that for the student to make their project stand out, they really should go back to the judge criteria. We're looking for strong research, we're looking for a clear argument, and then we're looking for that project to really use the exhibit to support and prove that argument. And so look back at the criteria and make sure you feel like your project is successful in those ways versus, you know, adding, sparkling lights to the top of it or some other sort of trick to gain people's attention. I think that for me, what really stands out in a project is when it's well organized and clear. When I don't feel like as a judge I have to dig through a ton of pictures, a lot of quotes, you know, when I can't find the thesis, all those things turn me off of a project because I have to work really hard to try to find out what the student is saying because their voice is lost. But I think that if you can think about making sure that your voice is really clear, you're going to, you know, be able to support all those other wonderful History Day criteria.
That's a great point. We talk about editing in every single type of project. If you're, you know, writing a paper, you have to edit and rewrite, and it's the same with an exhibit. And in some ways, I think the exhibit writers have to be some of the best writers because they really have to think about what's in there. And I think oftentimes that clarity that Sarah talks about is really what separates one project from the next project. A question for John. Students ask, is it okay to use bullet points instead of sentences as a way to kind of get a little more information in there? And when might you want to do that?
Well, I would say it would all depend on what you're trying to convey. But if you're trying to come up with a listing of ways that, say, a leader has impacted you, has made an impact, anything like that, I think that would be okay. When you do, if you are going to do it, though, you need to make sure that those bullet points are solid and they are thoroughly researched to the point to where you don't need to go in with any more explanation than just a bullet point.
Okay. Question for Barbara Ryan from the Twitter feed. Student asks, can you use statistics or data? And the answer to that is yes. But can you give some suggestions where data or statistics could be used effectively in an exhibit and not just putting lots and lots of tables there?
Sure. We have statistics in our exhibition. Ryan was referencing the Selma March, a 51-mile march, and along the way at the various stopping points, it's important to note and visually exciting for visitors to see at what point the marchers were in that march. And so we put a graph on the wall, and it marks then those various locations. You've gone 14 miles here, you've gone 7 miles there. Additionally, we have in our Mississippi exhibition statistics that bear out just the inequities that African Americans experienced. And so statistics like 5 hospitals for more than 1 million African Americans in Mississippi throughout the whole state, where they could be seen, pointed to the disparity in health care and the availability of health care. Talking about income levels versus income levels for black teachers and white teachers. Statistics that show the cases of unprovoked violence, are really striking. Also, throughout our exhibition, we document, of course, the voting rights, the success of voting rights, and what opportunities that extended. And so, throughout the exhibition, you'll be able to see at various points how many African Americans were voting in various issues, and you can look at government and the progress that we made as a society, and look at those numbers and be able to tell then exactly why the movement itself was so necessary and what it did accomplish.
Excellent. Sarah, one last question for you. Students are asking, well, come on, what if I'm like a little bit over the size limit or just a little over the word count? Does that really matter? Can you answer that question for that student?
Sure. Here in Minnesota, we do have judges looking at word counts. We have rulers, and are taking note of size. And so I wouldn't count on just sliding by, not just because of the competition, because I think you have to think about this as a fairness issue. If you're significantly over on the word count, it's a pretty unfair advantage over your competition. And so we want to make sure that it's an even playing field. I think that you don't want to set yourself up in a situation where judges are looking at two projects. They feel they're both pretty equal, and they have to move the one without rule violations, sort of higher on their list because of that. I wouldn't want that student to sort of in retrospect go, maybe I should have thought harder about the rules on that one. So keep it in mind, do your best to work with it, and know that the judges aren't there to throw the book at you, but there are rules in place for a reason. We're not just trying to be meanies.
That's a good point. And the point that Sarah made about keeping it fair and equitable, it wouldn't be fair if I let one student do a 5-minute documentary and the other student do 15 minutes. Same rules here. Final question here for Barbara and Ryan because I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. What are some tips that you can give students to help make their exhibit look professional when they're working on a shoestring or just above a shoestring budget? What are some tips that anyone can do regardless of money?
Well, I think design is really important, and so to look at the entire space, figure out how best to utilize it, how to divide that space up to accomplish what you want to accomplish. Neatness always goes a really long way in any project, and so if you're fixing things to the wall, how can you make those seams invisible? Scotch tape and push pins have a place, but not necessarily in your exhibition. And so I would look for ways to make it as seamless as possible, as professionally laid out as possible visually. Ryan, you got any thoughts on it?
Creative design, definite historical accurateness, something that's going to draw a viewer's attention immediately. So first impressions go a long way. And something that's thinking outside of the box. As you made the reference, if you were going to do something on the Civil War, some sort of weaponry would not be thinking out of the box. Think about something that could have happened through those turbulent 4 years that you can base your project around.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for these great tips. These are really, really helpful. I'm going to turn things over to Julia Wynn, but I'm just going to mention for everyone who's watching, if you could just take a moment, right below where this screen is, we have a survey link to give us some quick feedback, and that would be really, really helpful for us moving forward. But at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Julia.
Thanks, Lynn. I wanted to thank all of you all for joining us this evening. I especially want to thank our presenters, Barbara and Ryan. We really appreciate all of the insights that you gave us into how to design a really effective exhibition. And finally, I just want to remind you that NEH has a lot of resources that could help you in designing and creating your National History Day project, whether it's the resources at Incitement or Chronicling America. So definitely check out our website at NEH.gov and see if there are some things there that can help you out. Finally, don't forget your State Humanities Council. Every state has one, and a lot of the state councils are very actively involved in National History Day. And so they can be a great partner and resource to you as well. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you to our coordinators, to our teachers, and to our students. Best wishes as you're getting ready for those school contests, regional contests, affiliate contests, and we hope to see many of you at our national contest at the University of Maryland at College Park in June. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night.